Yeah, exactly.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Arnel. It's on top of the hour here, and we'll get going here. Really excited about this panel. We have an amazing team here. So I'll just briefly introduce them. You can see their bios on the website, and I think most of you have downloaded them already. So I'll start with Dr. Aleks Nesic with the Joint Special Operations University, and also worked for the Department of State in a capacity for teaching. Has been a good friend and colleague of ours. Many of you already know her from the Civil Affairs Association. Colonel Dave Allen, who's been double dipping today into two different webinars to help us out. Very popular today, Dave. But Lieutenant Colonel Dave Allen is the lead for irregular warfare and stabilization concepts at the Land Warfare Center. And then we have Brian Mitchell, goes by Mitch, and Francesca. So they're from Crisis Cast. As you can see from their bio, they're also actors and actresses from that played in different roles and writers within a very, very expansive network within the film industry in Hollywood. So really excited to have them on today, and we'll get going here. So to get started, I think you can see the slide here, and what I'll do is I just to set the stage of what this idea is that we have here for this prototype called the Human Domain Matrix. We as a group with Dave and Aleks, as we've been writing early on, have identified that many times when we go overseas, we have 20-somethings, many of us before when we were younger, found ourselves in these places where we're operating amongst the people, and we had a fairly weak understanding of the local dynamics of the places that we found ourselves in. So in understanding these indigenous populations. So we wanted to find a way to leverage technology and understanding the science of the human domain to better understand people in an accelerated manner versus just going through culture training, don't show your feet, and Aleks will talk about that. And so with this collaboration, and I'll let Dr. Aleks Nesic, she's been the co-conspirator at the beginning of this, lynching us all together to get us going, explain how this got started. But that's generally the idea. You can see on the left of the slide where we have the science of the human domain and a lot of the stuff that we were teaching at Fort Bragg, combining with the creative power and the technology in Hollywood, with a lot of the technology that Mitch we'll get Mitch and Francesca talking about, but really also the power of storytelling and narrative. We'll get into that, and so there's a lot of stuff to cover in this session, and I'd rather not do less talking and more moderating. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Dr. Aleks Nesic to explain how we got started.
Sure, thank you so much, Colonel David. Thanks to Chris, to the whole Civil Affairs Association for having us on today. Always a pleasure. Too bad we couldn't be in person, but all right, so thank you also for getting all of our materials up here, and I'm really happy to see our training books. Let me give you a little bit of a background on how we came to have this innovative collaboration. Valka-Mir, our company, has been working on developing advanced education and training curriculum for Special Operations Army, Special Operations community for several years now. It was primarily driven by the initiative from General Linder, who said, the curriculum, the culture curriculum that was also mentioned in the earlier session is outdated. It doesn't meet the needs and requirements. It is very surface level, and I want you guys to start cracking the code into this human domain space. And I know the human domain can be very controversial. Nevertheless, scientifically, we're talking about the human domain population dynamics, right? And so Dr. Patrick Christian and I have been working on developing and enhancing what did seem to be a very surface level sort of cultural training program. And in that space, we recognize that it is really important to combine 3 different scientific disciplines in order to help the operators understand the population on the ground. Someone asked a question in the earlier session, well, how do we get into the root causes of violence or terrorism? And that's still a big question that everyone is asking about. Well, we've been working in this space for a very long time in conflict, post-conflict zones, studying, analyzing populations from a phenomenological perspective. And everyone laughs when I mention this word because not everyone sort of wants to understand what it is, but really what it means is the lived experiences of the population that we're talking about, people that we're talking about. So once we started to develop our human domain matrix, which is the analytical tool that collects the data and analyzes the data, this thick data that Colonel Allen mentioned earlier that is absolutely necessary. And Arnel and I have written a couple of papers on this, and mad scientists, the Army Mad Scientists Lab has been very supportive in us showcasing and highlighting the importance of the thick data approach to understanding population dynamics. So we started developing these training books. You see some of them here on the slide to understand these deeper, more covert dimensions of population or human domain. And throughout that development, and we spent a lot of time training our civil affairs teams, PSYOP teams, and other special forces teams through case study analysis, getting them to really step into the reality of their target audience, is when, again, the credit to General Linder, who said, well, wouldn't it be amazing if all of your training can come to life in a 3D sort of classroom setting where my guys can go in and engage with the audience prior to getting into the village, into the community. And so long story short, meeting Mitch and Francesca in London at a conference in December provided us with that opportunity or that platform to start the conversation about, because of their technology and their capability to bring so much to life, so much that the thick data and the sort of the type of analysis that we do to bring it to life. So I'll let them get into the more technical aspects of this, but I'm just really thrilled that we've been able to, in such a short amount of time, already develop a prototype, and we'll be testing it soon with a specific case study on Mali, because that is our critical area of operations right now. It is a very difficult one. We talked about the complexity, so we've been cracking the code on not only that cognitive engagement, but the emotional, deeper emotional, trauma-driven population that is being weaponized against each other and against the local governance structures. And we think that this is really exciting and innovative for operators to get into this 3D space and understand the terrain that is much more complex than reading a textbook or watching a video about it. So over to you, Mitch and Francesca, and thank you again, everyone.
Cool, thanks, Alex. Shall I leap in?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, so as Alex said, it was a fortuitous meeting. We have a company, so we're the sort of the UK base of what Arnel David calls Hollywood. And that's largely because my family makes big budget films out of Sydney, in fact. So Sydney is the HQ and LA is the market, and we sit in the middle of that in London and interface between the two sides. The projects are usually very big, so they're multiple millions, and there's time between them. And as Francesca and I were both in a previous life performers, we've always looked to fill that space. And one of the things that we started doing was professional role play, and that evolved into psychological role play with teams of actors who we brought a psychologist in, and we developed a palette of behaviors that that first responders, the security industry could use to practice one-on-one, certainly in trauma or in high stress situations. And Crisis Cast has been going now for nearly 8 years, and really it was a result of Crisis Cast that we met Aleks at the International Security Expo in December. So our experience really, and I'll pass on to Francesca a little bit on this, but our experience really has grown over that time into expertise of a sort in developing immersive scenarios. So we specialize in the story that can surround a learner. And more that's evolved into, into pinch point moments, into stress responses, into both the physical, psychological, and at times the spiritual response that, the first responders, blue lights, military, MOD, diplomatic, humanitarian can practice with us, so that once they encounter a situation in the field, they've had that experience once already, and usually the response is more metered. They can feed a little bit of the intellect into that rather than it being purely physiological. And so that's sort of the area that we're, just to keep it short, the area that we've developed some expertise in. About 2 years ago, a government client asked if we could film an MTFA so that they could use it as a desktop exercise, and that sort of for us completed the circle, because we were right back into the filmmaking expertise, and from that developed a series of offerings which really has led to us taking on the human domain matrix and developing a virtual reality. It's just an extension of what we've been doing anyway, with 50 actors in a crashed fuselage on an aerodrome, you know, to one-on-one. It's the same for us. It's the same meter. It's got to be a real story. It's got to be real people communicating in a real way. And you know, working with Aleks and the military is fantastic for that, because it's those details that suspend disbelief for the learner. It enables somebody to really participate in that, and so I guess that's I could go on for hours about it, but I won't. So I'll hand over to the brains of the company, Francesca.
Well, I think that's exactly what you were about to say. I'll just pick up where you were leaving off, which is that what we specialized in was accuracy. We wanted to make sure that we had, hence the fact that we got a psychologist on board for us to make sure that the behaviors that people came across in an exercising setting were accurate. And then once you had that accuracy and that professionalism, we found that not only could an exercise be very beneficial in the fact that you learn your own insights, that you develop your insights as you go through it, but because you've got professionalism and accuracy and the ability to turn up or turn down, you can add learning into an exercise. So one of our clients likened it to a wind tunnel. You can put people through a situation and an experience, but with calibrated outcomes. So one of the things that we found fascinating about the first time we spoke to Aleks was this idea of that is what we need. We need something where we are training a specific series of outcomes, but via the experiential and via very accurate behaviors and recreation of a culture. And one of the really exciting things was that this company that Mitch's family runs over in Sydney is mostly to do with computer generated imagery and animation. And they have hands-on to some of the best cutting edge recreation of the immersive and the accurate in human behaviors. And when we started talking to people in terms of this, the extraordinary brains that have been involved in that were quite excited by the fact that they were doing these multi-million-dollar budget, huge Hollywood blockbusters, but they were almost more excited by the idea of putting that skill and that craft into some other use, into some really positive use. So we've got access to people who, on something like this one, would never have been able to buy into, but they really want to do this. They want to use that extraordinary skill that they've got of making something highly immersive and highly accurate, and therefore utterly creating of insight and of a way of learning, but using their extraordinary skill, the fact that you really can put almost anything into these things. I
think we'll come on some of the content in a minute, but I think that's a really good point. And just by luck and good chance, we're able to draw on, you know, a phenomenal talent base of you know, highly credited technicians, you know, writers. So we've got Suicide Squad team, we've got the Hulk team, we've got Lord of the Rings team, and the family franchise is the Mad Max franchise. So we're on its 5th iteration now, and every time it's become you know, much more of a special effects feature. So you know, even Charlize's arm, you know, which was missing in the last one. I don't know if you've seen it, but that, you know, even that's quite a demanding effect to sustain throughout a 90 or 120-minute film. And the other thing is just Happy Feet was one of ours, Babe was one of ours. So we've got real expertise in creating credible storylines that affect and influence people through the use of technology. And really, technology is incredibly dull, actually. You know, a rig for a VR character is very dull. There's no animus in it. But Francois Laroche, who's working with us on this VR project for the Human Domain Matrix, is the man who created the Gollum face. And that's the first VR character that was that was known, that was accepted as having animus, as having an internal soul, an internal being.
That was Lord of the Rings, wasn't it? That was that.
Yeah, the Gollum from Lord of the Rings. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, that was the only point I wanted to make. Back to you, Arnel.
No, that's amazing. So just to highlight from that, what you just said was that because of all the investment that you're through your network and from the film industry, all those technologies, I mean, countless, millions of dollars and pounds of investment, we're able to benefit into this, to leverage for this particular prototype. So, Mitch, I have your video here. It's this 90-second video. You want to go to? I think it's probably a good spot to play it, and then we'll go to Dave on the what we're doing with the British Army.
You there, Arnel?
It looks frozen on my screen.
Yeah, it's frozen on mine too. Yeah. It's like we've lost Arnel, I think. Do we have a copy of it here?
Not loaded now. It has to be reloaded.
His computer crashed. Dave, go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, well, Arnel wrestles with the technology. I'll just highlight, really picking up the thread that we had from the last panel, actually, is this sort of the advantage you have in outreach in human engagement as one of our tactical functions. It's considered to be our key advantage. But it's very difficult to take a young guy straight out of training or in their 20s into what would be a completely alien culture to them. And as Aleks said, the ability to actually get a depth of understanding before you go into a situation is absolutely critical in some ways, because you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. So it's better if we can actually prepare people for the sort of situation they're likely to get into. And the beauty of this sort of immersive technology is actually you can probably learn at a faster rate. Hours of classroom work can actually come in. In fact, it should be coming through now.
Sorry, Dave. I was just teeing it up and letting you finish. I'm sorry about that. I have too much going on my Microsoft Teams and Slack and all these things. It killed my computer, so I had to reboot. So I'll play this right now. Sorry, folks. Okay, so Dave, I think you already started to, and I dropped out, but you want to go ahead and chat about what we're going to do here with the British Army and how we're going to get this initial prototype going, and how in the area that we're focused on in West Africa, and how we're going to probably integrate different units across the Army to get soldiers and operators involved early on as we prototype this thing. Over to you.
Yeah, I was just, before the video played, I was just outlining the problem as such as it is how do you get the real in-depth cultural awareness, understanding that you need, rather than the sort of often quite superficial sort of impressions you get from cultural and sometimes language training, which is often is fine for ordering coffee in a restaurant or something like that. But actually, we're entering areas which are traumatized. So actually, it has to be a lot more different level of understanding. And actually, the ability to immerse yourself in a scenario is absolutely critical. And so one of the areas we're particularly interested in, and why we're sort of looking at it for the prototype of Mali, is to demonstrate the concept. And obviously Mali is a complex operating environment. It's not one the British have operated in much before. Obviously, sort of Francophone Africa, we haven't got a long history in that area, particularly anyway. So anything we can do to sort of ease our activities in that area would be particularly useful. And actually, it's a current area of interest. So actually, if we were going to demonstrate anywhere, it's as good a place as anywhere. But actually, the beauty of this is the human domain matrix can fit any scenario, but you have to start somewhere. And actually, the Mali scenario was a good one to start with. And the way we're actually going to try and sort of help develop it is, firstly, we want to work to make sure we get over the barriers to learning, which soldiers are, the worst moviegoers ever, to be honest, because they'll spend the entire time saying, oh, they wouldn't carry that weapon, they wouldn't store that there. And actually, they don't immerse themselves in the story. So, we want to help get over that, get over the barriers to that. So actually, the guy stood next to you does what a guy who would stand next to you does. And so they don't fight essentially the picking up that actually he's laced his boots up the wrong way and all that sort of stuff. So we can help with that, but it's also about shaping it to the realistic sort of things that people are going to be doing. And essentially we're going to look at potentially trialing this sort of technology with two groups. One would be people who are actually going to deploy to Mali in that role, so they will get a clear benefit from doing it, but also a casual user group, we're calling it, which will be people who operate in similar people-facing outreach type tasks, but not necessarily specifically Mali, so they wouldn't know anything about it potentially, but actually then see how people react. And I think the key thing, the more it gets used, the sort of better it gets. So the more people do it, because it's repeatable. And role players and exercises are quite good, but they get tired, they get bored, and things like that. Whereas this won't. So they'll always react as if you're making that first interface. And we will develop how we're using it and actually integrating it potentially within live exercises, so that someone gets told they're going for a meeting with somebody. They may have seen them as a distance, so they may be a little role player and they've seen them walking around in the distance, but then they go into use this sort of technology and then they put the headset on and they're actually talking to the guy. And the role player knows what that sort of person will be doing, but the face-to-face will be through this. And they will potentially, we get hundreds of people could go through that and it will learn. And it, potentially could give you some really interesting feedback. Because the unique thing about this sort of approach is this is completely non-kinetic. Most immersive technology is first-person shooter type stuff. It's been around for a long time. The top cover, machine gunner, aircraft simulators. Whereas this is actually looking at the emotional human side, completely non-kinetic, and actually, it doesn't turn into a gunfight, but actually you create problems if you don't get it right. So it's actually people seeing the second, third order effects. And actually one of the critical things will be the debriefing afterwards. It's not just something you put on, it's what you learn from it. Because the beauty is, because of the level of the technology, it will react, according to subconscious acts of things that people don't even realize they do. And eventually will show up people who are actually better at this than other people. It's not because of training or anything. There's sort of people who could pick this up and just be quite good at it naturally, and yet there'll be other people who could go on as many courses as you want but are still pretty rubbish at it. But that might it would be useful for commanders to know that actually, yeah, you're really good in this unit, but actually don't ever speak to people. Just stand in the back to get people in the right sort of role. So I mean, there's great potential in this, and I think being in at the development sort of phase, I think is particularly useful because we can shape it towards something that will be familiar to our guys. Because you say the big barrier, and we've talked to Mitch about this. It's the barrier to learning, and it's policemen are probably the worst watchers of TV cop dramas. Soldiers are the worst watchers of war movies. And if you get over that and get in the realism and just get into it, we really feel that there could be some real value in this.
That's a lot. Yeah. No, go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, David. I was just going to say that a question came through to me about role play versus NI characters or CG characters. I mean, Crisis Cast started off as live role play, and we recognize the difference between the two. And there's a really great difference with VR, which is that in a role play, everybody understands they're pretending, and even the best role plays and the most psychologically trained ones, you still know if you're presenting as the learner to the role player, you know that it's framed in self-knowledge, right? What we're finding with VR, and it's been around long enough for there to be data on this, is that it happens inside your head. So it's a really internal transformation. And just picking up on your, cockpit VR or first-person shooter VR, that is, the responses that are happening by the player in that are internal responses, which is why there's stuff going on with Fight Club, which can analyze some of that as well, with Arnel's Fight Club as well. But the key difference with us is that we're not looking at the kinetic, as Dave said, we're looking at the psychological. And that's why it's so important to build these characters with animus. We have to build these CG characters very accurately, and they're going to have multiple responses built into them based on the AI. So if a player is very trigger happy, their mission objective within the game ain't going to happen. It's just not going to work. And so their mission objective will fail. If they're too passive, they will equally probably get overrun by the players. So getting the balance right within the AI engine is part of the learning. And then the analytics derived from that at the other end is going to be phenomenally interesting to Dave and his team to see that of a cohort of 1,000 soldiers or 500 soldiers, that there is a tendency at a particular juncture, at a particular choice point in the story, there's a tendency to overreact or underreact or sidestep or ignore. And the cost of that, of course, will be available in the analytics, which will be visualized at the other end of it. So it's an incredibly rich medium, and I'm afraid, I think it knocks the live role play out of the field for the time being. I'm sure it'll come back.
And just one other point on that is the ability to repeat accurately.
Reps and
so
text,
it's being able to go back over it with exactly the same entered data, as it were. So what you're coming up against will be exactly the same because it is literally created totally accurately for behaviors. But if you change your behavior ever so slightly, it will change ever so slightly. So that the more you repeat it, the more you realize what the implications of your behavior are, what the implications of their behavior, what you missed last time. So that ability to go on and learn really quite quickly, as you said, Dave, go back on that thing of, you can go back in, go back to the beginning of the roller coaster almost immediately. You get to have another go instantly and learn.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much here. I mean, there's loads of applications, and I can see a lot of questions coming in. So this is good. We'll get to Q&As here soon. So as you talk about the technologies, I know that we have, so Mitch and Aleks, or Mitch and Francesca, there's also the artificial intelligence and what we can do with some of the data, the lie detection, some of the things that there's loads of stuff we can get. We're gonna get a lot of mileage out of this prototype. We'll get to that, and so think about that. If you can highlight that, and then I want to go to Aleks next and talk about some of the science behind this, the psychosocial sciences behind the human domain matrix.
Thanks, I really appreciate that question. So the science behind this, the social science behind this, I'll tell everyone what it's not. It's not political science. We've had our conflict practitioners, operators be so much influenced by political scientific approaches to what's happening in other countries, why violence happens and how it's analyzed. We stepped away from political sciencey sort of explanations because as they say in that surface, well, sort of Westphalian level of explanations that that are in a state space. We also looked at the failures of the early human terrain programs, which were largely dominated by one approach, which was anthropology. Anthropology as a social science is a descriptive science. So it describes what a person does or a group of people does. And they wake up in the morning, wash their hands this way. But anthropology does not provide us with answers to why people behave a certain way, at least not to the extent that our operators need to understand those variables. And so when we started to develop this curriculum, we recognized the necessity for an interdisciplinary approach to understanding a human individual and then a collective, which is then deduced down to applying psychology's principles, psychological principles of sociology, especially social psychology, then curating that within anthropological space. So then we can understand what this hand gesture means, or what a particular look means when we're engaging with a person in Mali versus someone in Donbass in Ukraine. How do these cultural variations, like trauma, for example, which is found everywhere, I'm glad that Dave brought that up earlier too. One of our biggest breakthroughs in this space has been to teach our guys and girls how to message and engage their populations through trauma. So when we handed over some of this data that we collected, pages and thousands of data points, over to Mitch and Francesca to start building into the AI, it is to such a granular detail because we have to get it right. There's no room to make a mistake in this case, because a mistake could have lethal consequences for our learners. This is why we built so many of these different learning points. So a learning point would be to react from a perspective of ethnocentric American perspective. Oh, this hand gesture means whatever, something in America. Well, it could be a very specific response from this particular person in this particular community. So you've got so many different choices. And therefore, one of the questions up here was on sense making. Therefore, you get to make sense out of things that may not make sense to you early on because you were approaching it from a very ethnocentric perspective. And we know that a lot of times we say, well, it doesn't make sense. Why are they fighting over this? Or why did this group come into a village and burn it down and then chop the people into pieces? That doesn't logically make sense. But to teach the logic behind violence, which does make sense in that particular context, and to teach the logic of trauma is a critical piece in this. So these three disciplines or sciences are invaluable, and we'll be utilizing them and applying them to all of the case studies we've been developing and data collection that we've been doing. So I really appreciate that question, because it isn't just some random anthropological explanation or description. It is a scientific study of every single community that then comes to life through the technology of Crisis Cast.
No, that's very, thank you, Dr. Aleks. That's really great stuff. So as I was asking Mitch beforehand, and Francesca, I know we've been talking about writing about lie detection and some of the data that we can analyze from different populations and make it culturally accurate. I mean, will we 5 years from now, if we had enough scenarios and we've studied enough different places, will I have a sensor on me where I can determine if someone across the table from me is lying? I mean, so a lot of our audience and a lot of the civil affairs folks are trained negotiators and mediators, and we want every chance we can get an edge over someone that we're talking to in a meeting would be really helpful. So maybe, I know that we've talked about this. Can you go over some of the technologies that are behind the HDM?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a really interesting point, and I don't know what the answer is. I suspect so, and I think if Elon Musk has anything to do with it, we probably will all know what we're all thinking of each other or about each other. So certainly this exploratory exercise that we're undertaking with Land Warfare Center now is about identifying what the strongest technological routes are to embed this learning. So the objective is, it's not, it's non-kinetic, it's stabilization in government, it's areas that require very subtle, nuanced exchanges with strangers who have a completely different background to, to the guy from Bristol or Ohio who's going to be encountering them, and who has a clear objective to achieve, to make ground in military senses. So, so the best we can do is create a very convincing story, populate it with convincing characters who have real backgrounds, who speak credibly, and then feed into that, sort of wire into that haptics. So we've talked about eye tracking already, and that's a great example. So if our guy from Bristol puts his hat on, puts the VR headset on, and is presented with a variety of characters at a particular point in the storyline where he has to make a decision about who to talk to, we're going to know which of those faces, and you've seen some examples on the film, they're really, I mean, they're photoreal faces, and the mechanics behind operating them are all informed by something called the FACT system, which is the facial muscle system that's now been incorporated into CG animation, and so that learner will have a choice. And it's really interesting. I'm looking on Zoom now, and I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can see 5 faces. Well, if I was wearing my Vive Pro headset, the analytics, the AI would know which of those faces I'm focusing on most. Is it the scariest one? Is it Dave Allen because he looks the most hostile right now? Is it John Black who looks charming? Or is it Aleks with the smile? Is it Francesca? I better say Francesca, actually, because yeah, it's definitely Francesca and all of these decisions are happening internally in milliseconds. And those decisions, which are non-verbal or maybe pre-verbal, Aleks, those decisions are those millisecond responses are going to inform the decision that will either take me through that guy to the next guy, because if the objective is a key leader engagement and I need to get to the top man, I'm going to win it through going through people on the way, winning people over on the way. And so much of this, I mean, we all know that the sort of the non-verbal verbal response to people. We all know Maharabian, I think his name is, the guy that, so 80% of it's not what we say, or it's more what we look like, how we're presenting as one human being to the other. Incidentally, and stop me when I'm rambling on too much, but one of the great failings of CG characters in movies to begin with was that they were too credible. And it's a really interesting point. So early CG characters, and the studios were striving to make as credible representations of human as possible. We, the viewers, went, nah, there's something wrong with that. That's very dodgy. Don't like that. And the studios began to learn that they had to ameliorate. So they had to make it very credible and realistic, but they had to ameliorate certain aspects of it. And the Japanese took off for that because they enlarged the eyes for a start. So you'll see any Japanese or any Japanese studio who's contributed to to Hollywood's character, you'll see that that it's very credible, but actually that they've expanded what we know about non-verbal human exchanges. And a lot of that's what we're incorporating now. Gollum is a great example from Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's not trying to be a human being, but he's a highly credible character. And you feel as the viewer that you know what he thinks. And when I say you feel as the viewer, that means there's a little playlet happening inside me, right? And so it's happening inside my body. It's in my head, really, but it's happening inside me that I feel I get subtext from that character.
I mean, going back actually to what you were saying, Arnel, it's possible that maybe we don't need a headset. What we will provide is the demystification of gut instinct. That idea that you will actually have developed the gut instinct yourself. So you won't need that. You'll know that having been through this, there will be things that go, hang on, that's not right. And you've got that anyway. Back to what you were saying, Dave, there will be some people who are just better at this. And you'll be identifying the ones who have got that gut instinct and go, yeah, there's something not right about the way he's twitching or whatever it is that he's doing that says I'm stressed.
But you guys have got a lot of that in the military anyway. I mean, the interrogation guys have so much of that minute knowledge already about giveaways. And one of the things we're going to be able to do in the game is if you have a choice point where the learner isn't sure about what to do, they are going to have the opportunity to strip away and go right down to the rig. And if that means that what's really interesting is that there's a little muscle that tightens here on a deception encounter, they will be able to see it. And just the process of stripping away the CG skin, the CG muscle, so the lighting, the skin, the muscle, and the bone right down to the rig, is they'll be able to see that work. And that's utterly memorable. if those skins go away and then are rebuilt again. You know, it might be that the pupil expands or contracts, or we might be able to zoom in and see that there's additional moisture on the skin, which is revealing stress in somebody that we're with. So are they telling the truth? Are they lying? Are they about to attack us? All that stuff. I mean, it's phenomenal. Most of that data comes from Valka-Mir, comes from Aleks as well. So
yeah, that's what we needed, that
we're
accuracy.
seeking to include that, yeah.
So much great
stuff.
stuff.
We're not
here.
excited by it at all.
No.
No, that we can go on. So selfishly, I can probably go on for a while here and just keep talking about this stuff, but we have such an engaging and active audience, a large audience, there's some brilliant folks in here. So what I'll do now, we'll just go ahead and segue into Q&A early and get some of our audience participating and answering the questions. So all of you out there, you know, I see some questions coming in. What I will do, if you're able to turn on your microphone or video, you're welcome to do so. I'll promote you to the panelists and you can ask your question live. So I think I have teed up right now, Dr. Black, sir, go ahead and ask your question live.
First of all, thank you to everybody. Just amazing discussion. My background is I am a retired police officer and retired civil affairs, also special operations. But interestingly enough, my doctoral work is in decision making, specifically sense making. And I deal with immersive training for police officers. I'm also an expert witness in federal courts to Dr. Nesic's thing when it comes to violence, because I speak to the decision making point during officer involved shootings. I was also a trainer for the Special Warfare Center. I was also part of the mapping, the human terrain, JCTD, and a bunch of other things. So first of all, my applaud to everybody here. It's a long time coming. You guys are working on amazing stuff. That being said, I would offer this. The idea of sense making, how we come to an understanding, and what I love about immersive training is a sort of like, and I'll speak to Mitch on this and Francesca, we'll just switch movies for a minute. I'll just take The Matrix and we'll just basically compress all of our experience in a moment of time, and I get the benefit of experience without being shot at. But I get the feeling, I get the sensory input, I get that internal synaptic pathways being burned, and I also get, more importantly, the consequences of it. And Francesca, what you spoke to, if I do it wrong, I can sort of reset and do it the right way until that becomes the synaptic pathway that I don't even know. Let's go to Gladwell's blink and this type of stuff. I don't quite know why it's there, but somehow I got everybody out of the fire in time, and then I have to be asked to explain it afterwards. You guys are creating that. This is new cutting edge stuff. So my question is, since you're thinking in a different way, and a lot of times we speak to people that have budget constraints, or they think linear, or they think these type of ways, how could we help them understand a different way of thinking? In other words, most in this community would agree right now on this webcast that this is a way to go. But other people will look at it and they don't understand the immediate value because you don't have metrics or some other types of MOEs or this type of stuff, which are usually linear measures, because how do you measure the intangibles? So the question is, on these things, for example, in sense making, we bring everybody through these training immersive environments. How are we tracking the value of this down the road? How do we bring the value back in to show them? Because a lot of times at the end of the day, the ability to get these programs enacted is not only a connection, it's the ability to show in modeling. And I'll speak to momentarily to Cabrera's work with systems thinking. One of the nice things about mental models, conceptual models, is we could actually take some of the outcomes of what you guys are doing, put them in a visualization. The cool thing about visualizations are that it's very hard to only take a certain part of the narrative for selective learning out of it. You look at the whole picture, you can't only look at the blue part of the picture. Your mind really isn't geared towards that. How can we take these things, turn them into some sort of visualization, and then to Colonel David, we could take these visualizations, which in fact would be a two-dimensional mental model, and Colonel Allen as well, and we could put these into policy. We could take our learning and put them into policy, the conceptual mental models that come from the learning of this, as potentially a form of engagement to policymakers, or a form of engagement to budget approvers. And so my question is, any work being done on that, or just your thoughts in general? Again, guys, I applaud your work. I live in this every day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Black. So I obviously have thoughts on this, but go ahead. Is anyone ready to fire away?
Yes, I mean, there was literally one that we were working on today in terms of amalgamating the data from the AI, the long-term data, in terms, it has to be a particular interest of mine, but in terms of those operatives that go through and ignore what the women in the scene are doing, don't notice that actually there may be a woman in there who may be part of whatever it is that you're supposed to be noticing. So that sort of data point, which absolutely can therefore feed back into policy, can feed back into obviously the D&I agenda all the way through.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, just a quick question. So, Dr. Black, that's really interesting, and thank you very much for your comments. So we could answer that in terms of how we're looking to visualize the analytics, the outputs, and that would be a response to questions like, you know, what insights are valuable to obtain from a single soldier interacting with the VR world, or what questions should we ask the data to get those insights, or, you know, what data do we have? What data are we starting with? Any of those questions rely on some kind of investment into a solid data structure of some sort, so that we can filter the outputs through and then manifest them onto a sort of visualized dashboard, so that they're of value, particularly if we're talking about large cohorts going through this, and particularly if we're talking about large cohorts from different cultures, from different countries. So, you know, if this starts with Dave at Land Warfare Center, but it ends up with you know, Fort Bragg, or ends up with a humanitarian, how are we going to interpret that through? So I'm not sure that's answered your question, but and in terms of the stakeholders, the money holders, that's probably definitely a question for Dave. How have we engaged you?
Mitch, no, I think that's spot on, and to Dr. Nesic's point as well, and you guys have all alluded to it, is that this is one of the first places I've seen where you guys are using thick and thin data as a way to gain a greater insight. It's not just the statistics, it's not just the case study, it's the fact that they can both be used together to get a greater understanding. You don't have to solve something. The understanding in and of itself is worth the value of what you're doing.
Completely, and to that point, so when we've been working on the story, there's the classic, you know, the branching script of a game, where you've got to get it right to progress to another level. We started off in that model, and we've discarded that model, and we're now on a sort of point system. So you can't really get it wrong, but you can get an understanding of whether you conducted that transaction at a 5 or at a 2. And then at the end of the game, that point system will accumulate into, again, into visualization that should help you understand where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, or where a 2 could have been a 4 and how. Yeah?
And
Spot
the
on.
amount of your team that are the sorts that get 2s.
Yes, yes.
So you can amalgamate.
Go ahead,
that.
Alex. You have something to add, Alex? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to also add to or answer part of Dr. Black's question. We've been teaching this at Bragg for years now, and every time we've had teams with different experiences, obviously, but so many guys have come up to us in the classroom and said, now, whatever happened, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, this makes sense to me. This explains, now I get it. And over and over and over again, we've heard this, because this curriculum that we're still teaching until we get to the technology part, right? We're still continuing to teach this, because what it allows for the operators to step into that psychological, emotional life of their target audience, which they've never had before. So even in the classroom, when we're teaching and have slides and have case studies and are explaining these different dimensions within the human domain matrix, you know, how does the ego develop? What is the meaning of amygdala? How do you target that versus the prefrontal cortex? What does it look like in this culture, in that culture, with this society, with this group, and so on and so forth? So much of that comes up, especially with those who have had prior experience, who have had difficult and challenging experiences abroad, where things didn't make a lot of sense at that time. And now it's like, oh, now I get why the masculine identity collapses in this particular context. And what does that look like? How can I actually visualize that? What does that look like when I look around? And that was the training that they never had before. So now we're doing that. And then they'll have that reality experience once we have our products done. And so I'm really excited from a, academic perspective to teach a very applied, practical, realistic scenarios that obviously will only be multiplied because we'll have tech to assist. So I hope that answers your question too, because I've seen so much of that positive feedback from the guys saying, this makes sense to me now. It's something that happened 3 years ago that I couldn't make sense out of in Iraq.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, that's great answers. And so Dave, I don't know if you want to, we got loads of questions coming in. So do you want to quickly add to that? I guess what he was also getting after is how are we influencing the people that are going to pay the bills, right? Or to invest in technologies like this. And, for me personally, being involved with you and the team here, this unconventional partnership we formed, it's a bit of salesmanship, right? And choreography. I think a video like for the Fight Club, the fact that we craft like a 2-minute video to explain something, a lot of our senior leaders are super busy. So working on these 4-star generals and running around, I mean, they don't have time to digest a lot of long papers and not reading all these articles. So to me, I think that the way we were able to sell this in the headquarters there at the British Army headquarters were these videos, these quick glossies that would explain the technology or what we're trying to achieve, the innovation. But Dave, do you want to add on to that?
Well, I would say probably the critical thing is I sort of highlighted in the last talk was, in this sort of sub-threshold competition, understanding is the coin of the realm. That is what gives you the advantage. If you don't understand the context, you're never going to compete. So I think there is a greater there's a greater appreciation that understanding of itself has value, rather than understanding to achieve something decisive, because actually that's not the nature of great power competition with state or non-state actors. Actually, it's a constant thing. So actually, I think understanding as the coin of the realm, that has grown, that people do appreciate that. And as you say, is getting people to sort of get the initial pilot. I think once the pilot is running and people see what it does, it will sell itself. So, I mean, I think the key thing is you've got to start potentially small to demonstrate it, rather than, and then actually anyone who you speak to and actually say what this could do is it almost sells itself. But, it can be a difficult sell, but the first thing you do is actually demonstrate it. And I think that's the line we're on now. So hopefully that will expand the buy-in.
Brilliant, mate. No, thank you. Yeah, well, it's sold, and then we're going to soon be scaling, I hope. So Daniel Gomez, sir, I think you're next in line for a question. Do you have the ability to unmute or show your video and ask your question live, sir? Go ahead.
Yeah, I got to unmute, but I can't do the video because you won't let me. But it's fine. Hey, really important point on selling this. What we do is, and myself, I create immersive experiences as well. I'd love to talk to you guys afterwards, by the way. But the hardest thing about selling an experience is that, it's very difficult. It's not tangible. An experience is when you go through something, you have those feels, you have that learning. It's extremely powerful. So what we got to do is like what Dave said, create a small pilot sample where you get to immerse these decision makers in this process, so that they can feel what we're feeling. Because we know it works, right? We know that when you get humans engaging with other humans, the learning happens. So 2 things. One, Arnel, he said the video, you make a flashy video. And then the second thing is you get them in the experience with a sample experience as low cost as you can make it for an MVP. And then that's how you could sell it, if I can make the recommendation to you guys. But awesome discussion. I really think this is powerful. I've created multiple scenarios in Fort Bragg for the civil affairs guys, and I created my own company where we had civilians straight off the street being immersed in a fully complex scenario. It was entertainment based, so it was about the zombie apocalypse. But what we had in that scenario was the ability to replay the scenario, right? So they could go in a fresh start and make all their mistakes again, which you guys, Mitch and highlighted very well. And then what we also had in there was dynamism, right? The ability to change the story as it progressed based on the decisions of the characters. In too much training, anything in JRTC, anything in NTC, the National Training Center, Joint Readiness Training Center, everyone has all the answers. and you know how it's going to end, because on this day it's going to stop. We need to, in this type of training, we need to have the ability to adapt to the decisions made by the people that are going through the training, which we do very effectively with role players. We have to figure out how to do that with AI, VR, and everything like that. So I really appreciate letting me be a part of this, and thanks. I'd love to meet you all later.
Hey, thank you, sir. So let's go to Master Sergeant Thigpen. I see you have a good question there, sir, or Master Sergeant. Good. Can you go unmute and ask your question live?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
We're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I've got a background. I did psychological operations for several years, and now I'm the senior SIM NCO for 351 KCOM, working with Major Hancock. And my experience through both PSYOP and preparations for deployments and all kinds of stuff, the way that we have kind of taught our troops how to understand the cultural framework of the audience that we're working with is typically just to basically throw them a bunch of examples that they've had with, like, showing the bottom of the feet, and it's just a bunch of essentially tropes and rules of thumb based upon experiences. It's not really it's never really helped soldiers really engage with the idea of embedding into the way that the culture thinks about things. And I also haven't seen this this kind of concept really effectively participate in our planning process. And I think that it may be beneficial for us to approach this as a cultural narrative approach, and to investing into the way that the audience is thinking, that the population is thinking, and as a way of kind of framing how we bring these kind of tropes and experiences into a story narrative that allows us to have a practical approach for integrating into our assessments. And also kind of breaking that down into understanding the cultural ethic and how the systems, cultural systems are applied in real life, and then integrating that with our understanding of centers of gravity, decisive points, so that we understand the civil ends, ways, and means to unpack the civil problem. Is this cultural narrative approach at all relevant to your product, or is it applicable to what we're trying to solve?
Yeah, may I take that as a first feeling? Thank you for that question. That's great. And what I heard when you were talking was adaptability. How can we adapt? Because it's what we're doing in life, aren't we? We're having an encounter with somebody we've never met before, and we're continually skipping from foot to foot to find the right way through, past, beyond, or with that person. And in terms of how we're doing that, how we're incorporating that, for us, it's all about the script. So everything starts and finishes with the script, from finding adaptive storylines, finding branching points, finding alternative storylines to any given moment, because for any given moment in the game, there are at least 6 choices to move forward, sideways, or backwards from. And that's, so we start with the script informs the piece, it informs the budget, it informs the schedule, the casting, the culture we're addressing, it informs the learning outputs. It helps us understand what's good learning versus what's bad learning as an experience. It allows us to look at modularity, at interchangeability, at adaptability. All of that is really part of, which is why the synchronicity is extraordinary, because that is part of VR development. All of that is part of VR development. So if we can define good and bad learning behaviors as part of that, we're at least halfway there. And if we can test and pull and stretch and break the script before we start production, then we're more than halfway there, I think. Again, I don't know if that's answered your point, but it's what you made me think as you were speaking. Thank you.
Aleks, why don't you go next? Because you, with Valka-Mir, you guys have, academics and scholars on the ground that can help curate these stories and make sure it's accurate. Go ahead, Aleks.
Well, I was laughing when Master Sergeant said, the curriculum for PSYOP is what was it? Don't show your feet and how to drink tea. I think a lot of you have heard me talk about this, heard me say that same thing. When we looked at that curriculum, I mean, it was such a shame that that is the level of psychology the PsyOpers are learning, right? It's unacceptable. When we know that we have the opportunity to actually teach the real stuff, the actual reality of the psychosocial, emotional variables that are present within the population, the target audience that PsyOpers are supposed to understand and analyze it accordingly. Our data and our research and our work, the raw data that's coming from on the ground is from years and years. Many of us experienced on the ground in conflict, post-conflict settings, interviewing, studying, observing, analyzing populations that are either embedded in the ongoing violence or have emerged from that violence and are going through post-conflict, whatever you want to call it, the post-conflict recovery, post-conflict settlement, negotiation, doesn't matter. The population that's emerging from that space is still vulnerable to continuing influence by both state and non-state groups. And we're looking at how I think Colonel Allen was speaking earlier, even in the earlier panel, that our adversaries are actually really good at this stuff. They're the ones that are getting into the psychological, emotional space of the target audience, for which we're also fighting. You name it, right? East Ukraine, the Balkans, the brilliance of Boko Haram, of Daesh, and their ability to mobilize young people to come in and become suicide weapons is very powerful, because they understand. Now they understand it intuitively. We're trying to teach a scientific understanding. Now that some do understand it intuitively, depending on lived experiences and experiences abroad, but we're trying to teach it scientifically, so then we have equally or better messages and engagement strategies with the same population we're trying to take away from VOs and state actors. I don't know if that's also answering your question, but I wanted to reiterate the point, and thank you for recognizing that our PsyOp community does deserve much better education and training, and so the civil affairs, of course, to be able to influence the behavior of target audience, for sure.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.
So let's go up to Trace, an old comrade, CA friend of mine who's in Chicago now as a civilian. Trace, are you there? You want to ask your question? Okay.
Hey, how's it going? Sorry about that. I was looking for the unmute button. Yeah, I was just looking at from a strategic level, and this is kind of more along the lines of, I guess, U.S. military, and I apologize for segmenting it, but how is this type of training getting the view of senior leadership who create like a joint strategy, and how are they looking at integrating this type of activity into the force management model across the branches?
Okay, so that's probably a good question for Dave and myself. Dave, you want to take a crack, mate?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. Essentially, we don't know yet. This is part of the piloting. Ideally, in terms of training, this would be really good if we could do this within live exercises, and then the exercise is adaptable enough to change as a result of the decisions that are made in that engagement. It does require a different training scenario, a bit more free flow. And certainly within the UK, we're trying to get a lot more on where, the adversary has a vote. It's not just, there is an element of free play. And actually, as long as you create the box big enough, you can change the exercise as it goes on. So, I think, part of the pilot will be actually to show the potential of it, and actually, that's how you train, is you allow people essentially safe to fail is a key thing, where it's not just a purely linear process just to get a good report as the commanding officer. It has to be, just because it doesn't end, the story doesn't end as the script writer intends, it's not a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing because it's adapted, and actually people learn as much from the failure as they do from the success. So, you know, we do have to get away from the sort of stereotypical ticking training off. But you're right to highlight that actually, you know, it's not just, you know, the soldiers going through the training who have to change their outlook. It's the people who run the training, and, you know, even goes down to the reporting system about what is valued in what people do. You know, it's rather than saying, oh, well, your battalion failed on this exercise, actually, you know, a little bit more granularity. And the very fact things like this can actually show, you know, huge amounts of data of where the decision points were. And, you know, you do learn as much from, probably more from failure than you do success, where actually what we need to get away from the idea that you're just going through, you know, a strict script. There is only one way to go through it. You know, it always, you know, Henry V always ends in the same way or something like that. You know, it's got to be the ability of, you know, it's everybody. It's not just the training audience. It's the people who do the training. It's the people who report on people as well. So, you know, to get this, the full power of this, you know, it is quite a psychological change, but actually I think once you can see the value of it and the impact it has, I think, you know, that is possible. It's completely feasible.
Yeah, not much to add there, Dave. You covered down. I mean, I'll just tell you this, Trace, that one thing we plan to do is, if you haven't downloaded those virtual reality, the newer ones, if you haven't donned a headset lately, you got to put one on and check it out, because I mean, it's changed dramatically in the past years. So one thing we're going to do right away is we'll get these generals and senior leaders, the Secretary of State for Defense, our SecDef equivalent, we're going to bring them down there and put it on. I mean, so this will be a central feature of this new innovation lab at Dorset, this prototype. And so we'll have a lot of people coming through there, and we just plan to let them see it and put it on, and let them see what Mali looks like. You know, it'll be like they're almost there, right? Transporting to that place. So, hey, great question. Good to see you on here, brother. So we'll go to next, Dr. Ernest Lloyd, sir. If you're able to unmute and ask your question, go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me right there. I really enjoyed this particular discussion more than I thought I would. I actually have two questions out there on the queue, so I'll hit them up as fast as possible. First, I guess primarily Dr. Nesic, though anybody else can join in. My background is as a CA guy, doing a lot of SIM type work, but also my academic background is in urban planning and urban economics. So I like the idea of the whole interdisciplinary approach to this. Can you discuss what interdisciplinary tools that you'll be using, not only to try to understand and digest of the situations that we're going into, but also to report those up? I know in this world of big data and AI, you have a lot of the data scientists loving to see their NLP approaches and whatever else. For those who are very familiar with social science, there was the content analysis where same type of idea, but just a little bit more laborious process to go through in order to break down various modes of communication, understand what's going on, probably group them and further analyze them. That's question one. Then I guess if I could pivot over to Mitch, as you were talking about some of the things that you were doing, you brought up using facial recognition, and I was just wondering how close to actuality are we really going to have that, and how are we working through the issues of facial recognition with, not a good way to put it, but non-Anglo faces? And since a lot of the areas that we will be going into are not necessarily popularized by Anglo people, so how would that particular piece work through there? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, sir. Anybody want to, Alex, you want to go first? You ready?
Sure, yeah, and I just put my email in the chat box, and I know Patrick is on too. Thanks, Patrick, for coming in too, because this is we can sit here and talk about data and research for hours, right? So just very briefly, and I'm happy to follow up with you via email and maybe show you some of the examples of our work. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you were on from the beginning, we rely heavily on analyzing our data through phenomenological analysis. Now, this is perhaps not familiar to a lot of people. It is kind of like the content analysis, but it gets deeper into the psychological, emotional, lived experiences of the population. And it's just like with content analysis, you know, you have your categories that you're grouping, the emotions, the behaviors, and so on. And so I'm happy to show you, and we, you know, some of that stuff that we've done. But it is the necessary element of bringing the concepts of psychology, you know, how does the mind develop? How does an identity form? Basically starting with Jungian archetypes. You know, what is an archetype? Archetype of a male masculine identity, feminine identity. What does that actually look like? What does it mean when it's being challenged? What is a person, what are the emotional frameworks? Our PSYOP guys would laugh at one of the explanations that we have for how does a person get from being alienated in the community to feeling rage and shame and rage. So we use stick figures to describe this very scientific process. But the guys would say, well, actually, I watched that happen on the ground, or in many cases, we get to experience the same thing. And so that will be one, the contribution from psychology, psychoanalysis. Then you get to extrapolate that into social psychology. So you bring it into a collective level. Well, what does a collective shame and trauma look like? How does a community behave collectively once they've been bombed, or once they lost half of their village and half of their children and the elderly? What does what do the survivors look like? What do they feel? All of that is necessary to curate within these disciplines, but then to also bring it to life, so then operators can have access into that space, which is unlike anything that they're experiencing at home, or, you know, maybe in some cases, yes, unfortunately, but to bring it closest to that target audience lived experiences, phenomenology as possible. So I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to follow up with you via email.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Mitch, you're on mute.
Thought I'd clicked it. Sorry, Dr. Lloyd. Yeah, just pick up on I hope I didn't say facial recognition, because we're not using facial recognition. We're using the facial action coding system, so the FACT system, which is really a sort of an encyclopedic assembly of most of the muscular actions that are required to express, from micro expressions to full on. And a micro expression will last from 0.5 of a second to maybe 4 seconds. And so the AI will be driving those, because they're really built into the CG character, into the rig. And there, of course, as I'm sure you know, there are some inescapable tells that we have. So there's a grief muscle here, and it will only contract when we weep, when we feel grief. And it's a complete tell, which a lot of the military guys will know, and they use that to, you know, to delve behind deception. And it's really and that's a good example of the grief muscle. It's a good example of what we're using, because it's one of the learning outputs really for us, is that the learner should be able to have a take on somebody whose language he doesn't speak, whose culture he doesn't share, whose background he doesn't understand, or she, and make a judgment, make a decision based on the basic human commonality. The grief muscle being a great example. Certainly, as Aleks, as Dr. Nesic said, certainly in terms of a traumatized culture, there are lots of those that we'll be able to bring to bear in this immersive experience. So we're not, in terms of multicultural, we're creating these characters. So, you know, our lead Tuareg will actually be created from possibly an assembly of images. It won't be a real Tuareg character, but it'll be an assembly of facial images that will represent that culture in that character very accurately.
And absolutely, I mean, I think I go back to that point that we were mentioning earlier, that the accuracy is crucial here. So you're absolutely right. I mean, an enormous amount of sim type footage and the previous iterations of this sort of attempt before have been based on Anglo features and have been based on a model. a simple model, and that doesn't work. Again, you get that thing of, as you say, as Arnel said, you know, the people watching this are the worst viewers of movies because they're sitting there going, nah, they don't look like that. That's just an Anglo face painted a different color. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. That is precisely the contrary of the accuracy that we believe we can bring to this.
Thank you for clearing that up. I'm sorry if I've misunderstood and misspoke. Thank you.
No, great. Thank you, Dr. Ernest. I don't know, Dave, do you have anything to add to that one, or should I move on to the next question? All right, mate. So let's go, because of my current role here at NATO, I'm going to go ahead and shift over to Ronald. He has some questions here about NATO sponsorship and interest. Ronald, are you able to unmute and ask your question live? If not, I can read it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I believe I can. How can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Good.
You're good.
Okay, yeah, I think one of the challenges we have for really getting our forces together to support everything that we're discussing here related to the human domain is going to require some work. It's not going to be easy, but historically, one of the most effective tools we've used to work our way through these complex endeavors is experimentation. The U.S. Defense Department has a tremendous background and experience in putting together rigorous experiments that draw in all the relevant stakeholders that can help provide the input necessary to craft an experiment. And it takes a little time to put together a campaign that would work this out. But when we talk about training our forces to better handle the cultural narrative and all the other complexities that we're talking about here, you would be surprised how much you could get out of a rigorous experiment by bringing, you know, Aleks and her team in here and others to help, number one, design the experiment. Number two, set the objectives, develop the scenarios, the master scenario event list and all those things, and play it out. Play it out in a realistic situation and take all of these working parts and technologies and everything and bring them together and draw the solutions that will help define the policy and the strategy and the training requirements and how to move ahead. And I truly believe that if we presented this objective to our NATO ACT command, which is right here in Norfolk, Virginia, along with DOD, and I would also suggest that you would have a tremendous amount of interest from the State Department and USAID as well, to bring this together and let's play it out in an experiment and see where we should go. It's been an effective approach in the past, and I think this is a complex set of moving parts that merits a rigorous experiment. So are we ready to move forward?
Thank you for that. So, I mean, I think we're ready to do that. So we welcome you to set something up for these guys to brief or present to NATO, ACT, and State Department. Is there any particular question you want answered?
Yeah, the question I have for the people here presenting today is, have we thought about pursuing experimentation as a solution to the number of diverse challenges we're discussing? Have we thought about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're definitely thinking about it. Does anyone take that answer that? This is a big experiment, so.
Yeah, I mean,
Dave,
I would
go
say
ahead.
there's multiple experiments going on, and at the stage we're at really at the moment, you know, there's so many sort of Army warfighter experiments going on. There's Air Force, there's Navy, there's our commandos. There's a lot of experimentation out there. This is, you know, as they say, every journey starts with a single step, and this is the first step to actually sell the idea, because a lot of the experimentation that goes on is very much focused on the kit. You know, it's about the drone, it's about the unmanned vehicle, it's things like that. Whereas actually this is something slightly different. This is, rather than moving further away from the sort of core of humanity, this is moving closer to it. So, you know, even looking at this is in itself an experiment. And so, part of the getting the buy-in to it is actually demonstrate that it works, that this is a thing. I mean, we've got two technologies essentially, where we've got a science and we've got a technology that both work. We know they both work. We're putting them together. We're not 100% sure that it's going to work, but that's what you experiment for. But if you can prove it does work, I think it speaks for itself. And this is part of our means to get that large-scale experimentation, because that's what's got to come out of it next, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Go ahead.
And it has to be said that we're calling this a pilot. This is a pilot. This is in order to get the concept visualized and realized, so that, as so many people have been saying, people can actually put the headsets on and see what it's about. Because I think you do have to build it in order to make somebody understand. It's if you talk about it theoretically and test and learn in theory or at the planning stages, it doesn't have the same impact as actually building the thing.
Aleks, I think it makes you and us lab rats, or Frankenstein and Fritz, or
scientists. We've already been declared mad scientists this year, which is pretty awesome.
I know.
That's
the
cool.
mad scientist fully on.
So Ronald, to close out, on that one, this project is rather ambitious, and in terms of experimentation, it doesn't get much more experimental than this, what we're trying to achieve here with this first prototype. So thank you for that question, and I hope that we can get something going in NATO and bring some of this over on that side of the house. So thank you, sir. So what I'll go to now is Robert Romano. Sir, are you able to ask your question? Go ahead.
Yes, I can. Basically, what I had is I come from an intel background and a civil affairs background. I've done numerous tours overseas, and as many of the other military folks have said on here, I've been subjected to countless campaigns in the simulation world, JRTC, the NTC rotations, all the war fighters at varying levels. My question to Brian and the rest of this, I don't want to come across as a Luddite. I don't want to come across as anti-tech, because I think this is a great idea. I think it really would have a lot of great application. My only question is there a way to, or have you thought about, so you're going full end of the spectrum, wanting to do all AI, but I'm wondering if there was a happy medium that could be found with live role players and the AI, even if not at the same time, have the scenarios built so that, for example, you go out and do a key leader engagement in a village using your process, and then you come back to a live role player situation where maybe the depth and the width and breadth of someone's experience might not be something that could be replicated with an AI. One of our warfighters, we literally had an ambassador role player who was an ambassador to Great Britain. There's no, as good as your AI is, I don't think you'd be able to replicate all of his life experience. So he was able to draw on years and years and years, almost like 45, 50 years worth of Department of State experience. So that's where I think that there might be, and I think if you did a hybrid model, it might be a bit more palatable to some folks who are a bit skeptical. What do you think?
Great question.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that is very valid, and Dave has already referenced the fact that we're heading in that direction. Crisis Cast grew out of specialist role players, psychologically trained role players. We're huge fans of that discipline. We're also huge fans of the VR capability in terms of deployment, because if we're going to look at 10 geographical locations for this, and we're going to have 10 different scenarios in each of those locations, then we're talking about the impossibility of getting 50 role players to move around the world and deploy in that size, just because the budget isn't there for that, really. So the VR allows us to do that. Point one. Point two is that the VR is looking at a very specific set of circumstances, learning outputs, really, which are based on the Valka-Mir matrix. So the understanding of that cultural environment. I don't deny that somebody with 20 years ambassadorial experience wouldn't bring a huge amount to it, but there's nothing stopping us researching that and bringing that into the script for that scenario, because it's not just sitting in front of the ambassador. It is, as you say, the knowledge and the wisdom that he's acquired over those years, and we can capture that in the script. It's what film scripts do. But yeah, so I would completely agree. I think there's a really rich possibility to hybrid this and to create event training, where you're combining a live moment after an immersive moment, after a VR moment. We use soundscapes a lot. We find soundscapes are incredibly powerful in training, where you can't actually see it. So the learners creating the film inside themselves, again, based on sounds that they're hearing rather than seeing stuff. So I think, Robert, I think all of these sensory possibilities for learning are really important. And they're not used enough. We rely so much on the printed matter or screen matter at the moment that, I hope we're moving into an age where the sensory, Dr. Black mentioned the Matrix earlier, that's sort of where we're heading. It's something that you experience. It may not be real, but you experience it as real.
And just to say that, my goodness, I mean, to come up against a role player who is an ambassador like that, the value of that would be immeasurable. It would be superb, but it would be really difficult to scale. And what we were trying to do was make something that was very scalable, but almost as impressive to the person who is there. Somebody who is the ability to give really an enormous amount of people that level of accuracy and detail and deep, shocking insight, which that wonderful ambassador would have been able to give, but presumably to 20 people that day.
If I may, and that's what that sort of ties in with what Dave was talking about more, the fact that you could. Let's say you're down at Fort Bragg. You go into a VR room. You do that scenario, and from that key leader engagement, something came out of it. You take that back out to the field where the exercise is and the role players, and then to Dave's point, they say, "Oh well, we thought it was going to go down course of action A, but it's actually course of action B," and then at that point, so you do have that. Because it's not just the people that were in the VR room, it's now the greater audience, trading audience, that just because of the nature of let's say a divisional staff, you're not going to send 200 people into the VR experience. You're going to be sending certain people in, and then they're taking that information out. I think it has incredible amounts of applications that could be utilized.
We definitely can do something like that. I mean, as you go forward, like Ready Player One, right? I mean, you're in a virtual world. Is that ambassador real or is he fake? I mean, so. Who knows? I mean, with the amount of technology that's present with cloud computing, I mean, we can do this stuff virtually and disaggregated. So we can probably bring in players from wherever into the Matrix, and who knows? It might be the ambassador from that country you're going into. It could be the youth soccer manager. It could be whoever. So that there's definitely a room for that. So thanks for that question, sir. So
could I
add one? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Alex.
Okay, go ahead, and then I'll
I just wanted to add one point to what Rob was saying, is that in a sense, we are already doing that. We're not including VR, but a lot of our incident management training already incorporates injects. It already incorporates picking up on what the learners do in response to an email that lands or a telephone that comes or the power being cut off. And, so a lot of that we're building in already, it's in play. That hybrid training environment is already in play a lot, actually, in the training world. It just doesn't include the VR bit yet, but it will.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, because I really appreciate that question, Robert, from an educator's perspective, right? How are we educating and teaching this? It will be very important to do so, because regardless of the experience that users will have in that VR setting, I at least still think that those of us who are on the teaching end should still be there to debrief, to discuss. Okay, so what went wrong? How'd you feel? What happened there? Just like we do in the classroom setting. I mean, that's what we do in the classroom setting all the time. And I don't think that component should be lost. It's not just throw people in the room and get them out and see you later, bye. But that real learning needs to happen with experts right there to debrief. And then that will also, I think, in my mind, from again, as putting on not my scientist hat, but my educator hat, be really important to determine some of the baseline learning and some of the advanced learning, because I would ideally, in my ideal world, like to see that we measure, that we do a pre-test. So we measure the learning, and then we have the experience, and then we measure it later on, because then we can argue for more scenario development, for more funding that will show that there is a learning experience that is concrete and valuable. But again, we're experimenting, so it's all experimental, even in the way we're thinking about it from the education and training perspective. So, but I appreciate that question very much. Thank you.
Dave, anything to add, or good for next question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So let's go to Brownwin. Morrison, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much. I work with a contractor with both state and DoD, as well as USAID. And I just wanted to see if you could share a little bit more on your storyline. And while I understand the previous comment about political drivers not necessarily showing the results that have been wanted in previous efforts, I wondered if there is political history that is driving some of these storylines so that the operator can ensure that some of these questions are being asked.
Great. That's a great question. Looks like Mitch, who's ready to go first?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, we're probably not ready to share a storyline, Roman, yet. But I think any storyline that the storyline that is being developed is based on historical and factual. And I can give you an example of the political, if I understand where you're heading with that, is that in Mali, and I don't think I'm talking out of turn here, in Mali, there's a local culture of resentment against the French. And that's tricky because France is an ally of Britain's, and a good one. But in order for a British soldier to advance in his mission, he needs to understand that. He needs to understand that the Tuareg do not love the French. And he needs to learn a diplomatic way of maneuvering that. And that's a pretty good example of how, within the game, as we keep calling it a game, but I'm increasingly calling it an experience now. But within the experience, we can present real life contemporary political stances that, in one hit, inform the soldier, practice him or her in a response, and help them identify a diplomatic route out of that, I suppose.
Yes, thank you. Because I think we all know when engaging in, I spent a lot of time in Somalia, and you could be in one region, but it can be a typical generic case that center to region politics is so important in these environments, as well as within that particular locality. And I was just wondering if there's a way to consider those beyond the colonial past, because the engagements that these civil affairs officers often have to face, and I used to brief them in Somalia quite a bit, are on some of these basic questions to understand those dynamics that then inform the cultural responses.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Let me add to that, because I think some of that was based probably on my earlier comments about political science is not being able to explain to us the real dynamics on the ground. So I want to clarify that, yes, within the storyline, of course, we have to pay attention to the local politics. What I want us to stay away from is to only be in that space of analysis, right? So oftentimes within state and aid, we tend to stay within that top level analysis. So this is where the government is, these are the opposition parties, these are the challenges, these are some of the local civil organizations, whatever. We are lacking even in the state and aid space to really understand the dynamics on the ground that we're trying to bring over into the OD space. And so, of course, political narratives are important to understand, political realities are important to understand, but how they're perceived and experienced by the people on the ground is, I would argue, more important than just understanding the political context.
Absolutely agree. Yes,
Yeah,
thank
so
you.
I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Great question. Thank you, ma'am. And so I know we're getting close on, we're at 90 minutes or so now, and we want to give everyone time to close out. So Dennis, I think you had your hand raised. Do you have a question you want to ask before we close?
Sure. Now, I don't know how I got my hand raised. I was moving around stuff on my screen, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank you and the panelists for all the stuff you guys presented today. You know, we at the Civil Affairs, the Army Civil Affairs proponent, have identified some training gaps in our training programs for Army Civil Affairs soldiers, and I think a lot of what you covered today is, you know, definitely supports filling those gaps. And Arnel, I sent you an email asking, can we get a copy of this, the video of today's session, because I noticed our training development folks did not make the session today, but I want to share it with them and take all this to the next step. And that's really all I have. Thanks. Over.
Yes, sir. No problem. Yeah, we'll definitely share this out with everyone that's registered, the videos, the slide, and the PDFs, the glossies that we have on this particular project. Because, yeah, Dennis, absolutely. I mean, courtesy of Her Majesty's government, the British here have invested in this to get it going. And I think that we can benefit from it on the other side of the Atlantic to move this further. So,
and you guys, the proponents, just very quickly, sir, you have our training book, our civil affairs training book in the proponent's office.
Yes, Dr. Nesic, we do. In fact, I participated in Silent Quest with Dr. Christian.
Perfect.
And it was an excellent week in Silent Quest. Again, I wish more of the folks at our proponent had been able to participate in that as well. But I've communicated with Colonel Liddick, our capability manager, and we intend to follow up with you guys on that and see if it's available to the rest of the force. Over.
Thanks, sir.
So I want to give everyone a chance, Alex, Dave, and Mitch, and Francesca, to close out with a couple comments. But for me personally, I want to thank you all for the time that you provide and shared with us today. This whole thing, and so really exciting project. I'm glad to be a part of it. I'll just say a couple of points that I just got back from Yuma Proving Ground, where Army Futures Command. We was at the request of the Secretary of the Army. I traveled with my general, and we brought some UK generals to go see a demonstration there, where you know, I was a part of Futures Command early on, and to see where it's come to today. I mean, the technologies are present to put them together. I mean, to make stuff, you know, to really change the operating environment, the battlefield. We need to embrace it. We need to have more leaders willing to take risk, like the British Army right here with this particular project. So in this Chris Holshake set up this to set up this panel to make it a regular feature every year, so that we can bring in more industry partners. Because for our, you know, large and small, these partners, you know, we got to invest in them. So thanks to Third Order Effects, to Defense Innovation Network, and to Valka-Mir for helping sponsor this whole conference and to keep moving things along, so that we can, you know, we need to keep these partners involved in what we have going on, invest in them, so we don't lose this industrial base for human domain engagement. So it's very important that we all all the leaders on here stay plugged in, see what's changing, and we help burden share to invest in these types of technologies to really innovate and change the way we fight and operate overseas. So let's go ahead with Alex. Any final comments before we close?
Well, I just wanted to thank you again. Thanks everyone, the Civil Affairs Association, Dave Allen and Mitch and Francesca. Onwards we go. This is very exciting, and I'm really glad that everyone is very enthusiastic and supportive of this. So that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. And likewise, very grateful, and you know, what an enormous amount we learn in these panels, because we're not military. We work closely with military and blue lights, but we're not military, and so it's highly informative to us, and it's a real benefit. And also to say that we're convinced that the moving image is at the heart of learning going forward, and so, you know, we're committed financially and emotionally to that as well.
It's always fantastic for us discussing anything with the military, because our stock in trade is drilling, and the military understand it at their roots, that you are going to be better once you've gone through it once. So it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, we promise to have more military acronyms for you to learn in the future on the next session.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Like, why are they yelling at me? Over to you, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Arnel. I mean, I think, this is really exciting stuff. And, so much of technology innovation almost seems to be driving innovation, seems to be driving humanity out of competition. This is actually bringing it back in, and I find that really exciting. I'm not a technology geek at all, as I don't understand a lot of this stuff, but actually the humanity of it is fascinating. And I think we need to always remember, this is a struggle between humans, and technology can help us do that. So, I'm really excited by this, and it's an experiment. Every journey starts with a single step, and this is that first step.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. And so again, thank you so much for your time and sharing, and really for the audience. It was really engaging. I mean, I'm sorry, I probably missed a lot of questions. There's so many out there, but we were able to get some of you guys to ask your questions live, and that's really good, and we appreciate it. So the next session is at 1400 EST, or 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is the final session where our younger and more brilliant diplomats and civil affairs practitioners are going to present their papers, where we vote and pick the best one. And so it's very competitive. I competed on this in the past, and it's a great distinction to have to win something like that, or to be a part of it. So please dial in at 1400 2 p.m. On the next session. So that's it. This is officially closed. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.